we go.
Hi, friends.
Hi.
My name is Sarah. I use she, her, and hers pronouns. And I'm a professional slut. I host the Queer Sex Ed podcast, which just got started about 6 months ago. We've been on hiatus until Monday, which is when our newest episode is going to be coming out because I was leaving my job. So what I left my job to do is a lot of things. But one of them is really thinking about how we can queer the institutions of sex health. And so when I say queer sex ed, that's not only a title to show people kind of what we're talking about, but it's actually an imperative. It's an imperative statement, right? So when I say queer sex ed, I mean we all must queer the conversation of sex ed, right? We have to focus on what assumptions do we make when we teach sex ed, who gets left out when we talk about sex, right? And who do we see as worthy of pleasure, worthy of sexual autonomy, worthy of not being violated, not having their boundaries crossed, right? Who do we see as worthy of that, and who gets left out of that conversation, okay? And one of the things that I think is really important about this is a lot of times when we talk about sexual health, we jump straight to the toolbox, the nitty-gritty type skills, right? We talk about barrier methods, and we talk about what types of sex people can have to keep themselves safe, and we talk about all these really technical things, right? But oftentimes what we don't do is the groundwork that we lay below that so that people can then use those skills, those technical skills, right? It doesn't matter if you know how to put a condom on if you don't feel like you can advocate for yourself with your partner to use a condom, right?
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't matter if you know how STIs are transmitted, sexually transmitted infections. It doesn't matter if you know how those are transmitted if your partner won't respect your boundaries and won't use the way to protect you, right? And so I think oftentimes in these conversations, we set people up for failure. And sometimes we do it intentionally, right? How many folks had sex ed that was full of shame, full of negativity, full of really, right? And we trick ourselves into thinking that fear and that shame and that negativity is going to keep people from hurting themselves or hurting other people. But it doesn't do that. In fact, actually, it creates an environment where that can happen. When you think about where does rape culture come from? Where does sexual violence come from? Where do these patterns of abuse and neglect and violence come from around sex? They come from us having gray areas, not from people not enforcing their boundaries or in a victim-blaming way, but culturally, because we don't talk about things around sex. We don't talk about how do you know if you're being treated well or not, how do you advocate for yourself, how do you really build the sexual life that you want. We just give people shame, we give people sadness, we give people fear, and then we say, go out into the world and figure it out, right? There's a lot of really good research that shows that when people are educated in an empathetic way about realistic sexual education, our fear is that it will make people have sex, which, by the way, who gives a shit if people have sex, right? Yeah. I am pro young people having sex with other people their age.
Yes.
In a way that makes sense for them, right? And when we do this education, when we do this work, we don't think about it that way. We don't think about pleasure. We don't think about kink. We don't think about polyamory. We don't think about these other things that people are dealing with and grappling with. And if we just give them the technical skills, but we don't make sure that they're heard, we don't make sure that they're in a position where they can actually be seen, where they can find partners that are empathetic and that want to have sex the way that they want to have sex, and where we can talk about what we actually want. If we don't give people those tools, then we're setting people up for failure, right? And oftentimes it comes out of fear, right? Sometimes we project that fear onto young people, right? We go well, they're just not ready for it yet. They just can't handle it. They're just not ready for those conversations. And what does that mean? That means the adult is not ready for those conversations. Right? Exactly. I'm scared, right? What would it look like if we had an adult that's I'm scared to talk to you all about this because I'm not really sure how it's going to land, or I'm not sure what your life is going to be like. I'm not sure if you're going to find partners that are meaningful for you, right? What if we actually voiced what those fears are? What if we actually said what we meant when it comes to sex, right? What if when I went to get an STI screening, get sexually transmitted infection screening, you might have heard STD or VD, right, venereal disease, right? So STI is more medically accurate language because all STIs can either be cured, which means get rid of them completely, or they can be treated, which means the symptoms can be reduced or dealt with in some way. So infection is a more accurate term when we talk about that. Also, STD is just a lot more stigmatized, right? It's something that's really negative, and it's something that you can manage, right? And if we lived in a world where we could trust to tell people, hey, I have genital herpes, and here's what that means, and here's how I know I'm having a flare-up, and here's what I'm on to protect myself, and here's the barrier methods we can use to have safe sex, right? Then all of a sudden that isn't such a scary conversation if you can be heard in that and not have somebody run away from you full of fear, right? And so oftentimes our fear is about other people, and it's about what other people think of us, or that we'll be ostracized, right? Humans historically come from small indigenous groups that were living in small communities, right? And if you got kicked out of that community, you were as good as dead, right? And so that drive in us is still really, really strong. We want to be included. We want to be a part of those communities. And so that's why when trans people talk about getting kicked out of our housing, when trans people talk about getting kicked out of our education, when trans people talk about getting kicked out of church groups or getting kicked out of friend groups or getting kicked out of whatever else, that is death. That's a death sentence to people. And we need to see that as violence, right? And so what we can do is we can't change the entire world at once, right? But we can start to change our own communities. We can start to change ourselves and then educate others about how we did that change, right? If you're a white person, learn about the legacy of racism and slavery and indigenous slaughter in this country. And then use that way that you learn to tell other white people how they can learn, right? If you're somebody who's had negative experiences around transness, around queerness, around whatever else, educate other people to the extent that you're able to about what went wrong and how they can do better. So that's what I have to start with. So I want you to turn to a few folks around you. It doesn't really matter how big the groups are, but maybe just like, some people next to you. If you're in this front row, I want you to talk about the first question. What was something you used to believe about sex, relationships, intimacy, whatever, right? Because we don't want to make assumptions that people are even having sexual contact or what sex even means for people, right? For some people, sex is a really intense cuddling session that feels really fucking good, right? For some people, sex is a really deep and intimate conversation where you feel like your brain is having sex, and that shit's hot. Right? I always joke with my partners. I'm like, my innermost kink is like deep, vulnerable, intimate conversations. Because A, everything else comes out of that. Everything else good. And B, it's just so hot. It's hot to see someone being vulnerable. I love that. Okay. Anyway, got sidetracked. So question number one: what did you used to believe about sex, relationships, and intimacy that you don't believe anymore? Right? What was something when you were younger, a week ago, whatever, that you used to believe that you don't? And if you're in that second row or the fourth row, third row, you can talk about this first question too. If you're in those other rows, talk about how did you learn about sex and relationships? Was it from movies? Was it from your friends? Was it from your parents? Was it from your school? Was it that you just figured it out by trying, right? How did you learn about sex and relationships? Okay? So introduce yourselves, your name, say your name, say your pronouns, meet somebody new, and we'll come back together. All right. Okay. So we're not going to have time for everybody to share. If you started some awesome conversations, I hope you continue those conversations, right? I think one of the reasons I started a podcast and one of the reasons that I want to build community around sex positivity and sex health, especially queer sex health that's focused on trans and queer bodies, is that I don't think these conversations happen enough. Right. Which is really, really true. It certainly was true in my life and my history, right? And I want to build platforms and spaces for people to keep having this talk, right? I am not the expert. I am somebody who has a lot of skills around media and around web stuff and whatever to help create places where this conversations can keep happening. But I don't want to hold all of it. I can't hold all of it, right? We all have our intersecting identities around privilege and also around oppression that make each of us unique in how we see the world, and we all see it through a different prism, right? And so. With that, I would love to hear what are some of the things that you talked about. And again, share your own stuff, right? We don't want to share somebody else's story. This is a room we didn't do a lot of ground rules ahead of time, but right, if someone's talking here, these are sensitive topics that are sometimes hard to talk about for folks, right? And that sometimes might have repercussions for people, right? You can lose custody of your kids if you're outed as poly or kinky, right? You can lose custody of your kids if people find out that you're trans, right? You can be fired from a job for all these things, right? So I want to build a world where that doesn't happen, but for now, we have to play by those rules a little bit, right? And so let's keep the conversations that happen in here. Other than you talk about me, I'm a public slut, right? That's my professional slut. You can say whatever you want about me out there, go for it. But let's hear from you. What are some things that you talked about? Some things that this conversation brought up for you?
This person talked about changing their views around monogamy and serial monogamy as the only way to have a relationship, and expanding that view to include polyamory and other styles of relationships as well.
Yeah, totally. Monogamy, right, is a thing that's sort of been taken for granted in a lot of cases, right? One of the things I used to talk about when I would go in to do LGBT training is also try and give people a little perspective around whiteness and colonialism, right? So we are occupying stolen land right now that was taken from indigenous folks. And the reason that land was taken from them oftentimes was a justification around their godlessness and their heathenism, right? And so looking at families that looked different, that were polyamorous groups, or looking at communities that had what we would see as same-sex relationships, but that weren't labeled that way there, right? Looking at people that, again, we would see as trans people in a white academic context, but that didn't have that language there, right? And didn't want that language there. When we look at that, sometimes it's easy to forget that a small group of white Christian men went around the world at about the same time, and with them they brought this idea that we have a shared history, that like the whole world has always been anti-gay and anti-trans, and that capitalism is the only way to live, and that polyamory isn't normal, and you have to be monogamous and have a nuclear family that's focused on passing down property, right? And so all of those assumptions that we make are part and parcel with our fear of getting rid of that stuff, right? Because we feel like there's never been anything else, right? And that's part of why we need indigenous folks telling their stories. It's part of why we need other people who are outside of that white Christian colonialist norm telling their stories, which doesn't mean that people within that don't also have something to give, right? If you've lived your whole life within that narrative, you have a lot to give too. But there's a lot of stories we haven't heard, and like you said, we're rediscovering a lot of this stuff, right? Trans folks have always existed in some form or another, right? Gender nonconformity, if you even want to call it that, has always existed in some form or another, right? And so when we talk about these things as new, when we talk about these things as a fad, as something that's coming up, we forget that history that's always been there. But yeah, exactly. It's something that's really scary for us, right? Because a lot of our expectations are built around projecting who will be in the future, right? That will want kids, that will want a house, that will want one partner that we live with, that will only want to fuck one person. What? If you want to, that's great. Not me. Right? But what I really want to advocate is sex positivity, and I think some folks in here may have heard that before, and some folks might not have. When I talk about sex positivity, sometimes in sex ed circles, that gets a little warped into like sex competition, where it's like, well, I've had a fivesome where I was like strung up and someone was beating my ass and I was getting fucked 4 times. Like, great. I'm glad you do that. Thank you for sharing with the class. It's a great image. And that doesn't make you better than somebody else when it comes to sex, right? If you're somebody who enjoys missionary style sex with one partner, that's also equally as valid, right? Exactly, right? Because sex feels awesome. And not having sex feels awesome too, right? But what I want to do is create a buffet, right? Where we can all come to the table and say, hey, you like those potatoes? Fucking rad. I want this pizza, right? Instead of this sort of tiered system of like, certain types of sex are okay, right? If you're married and you're heterosexual and you're cisgender and you're white and you're having missionary style sex to try and have a baby, like we see that as like way up there, right? And then if you're somebody else who's doing anything that we see as stigmatized, right? It's like anal sex and oral sex, maybe like one little rung lower a little bit, right? But even that's socially constructed, right? So oral sex, for example, 100 years ago was real dirty. Like nobody wanted to be doing it. It was very stigmatized. It was something that people did not want other people knowing that they were doing. It was something that was really negative, right? Versus now, if like you're on a first date and you're having sex and your partner doesn't go down on you, you're like, what the fuck is happening? For some of us. Right? But there's now this cultural expectation that that's part of our sexual script, right? It's like you make out and then you grope the boobies a little bit and then you put your hand down the pants and then maybe you're going down on each other or whatever, right? We have this sort of like script of things. And again, if you enjoy that script, that's great. But I want people to consciously choose that script. I want people to talk about it ahead of time and then decide that's what they want to do, instead of us all just being lumped into this giant pool and saying like, well, I don't really want to be doing that thing, but everyone else expects that I'm going to do it, or I'm never going to find a partner if I don't do it that way. Right? So yeah, expectations around monogamy, right? That's a really, really huge thing. Anyway, who else has something they want to say? Yeah, in the back.
This person talked about the experience of being younger and not seeing examples of relationships that weren't straight. They also talked about how not seeing examples of their type of relationship led to immaturity or the inability to form deep and meaningful relationships or plan for the future with partners because they felt like something was different, but they couldn't quite tell what exactly was different about the way that they loved.
Right. Yeah, totally, right. And some of that comes from our scripting, right? Even if you think of the most progressive sex ed that's existing in high schools right now or in middle schools, right? A lot of that is still like 1 week on LGBT folks, right? And usually at the end, right? If they have some bonus time, some extra time, they'll talk about us, right? You know, and so, yeah, a lot of this is really centered in a story of normalcy. And if you don't fit into that story, and you may not even know why you don't fit into it, sometimes for some people it leads to delaying, right? It leads to really rejecting anything that has to do with intimacy, right? And for other people it leads to risk-taking or trying sex that might be emotionally dangerous for you, physically dangerous for you, right? Because you might not really feel like, well, this is what I'm supposed to do, but I don't really care very much about doing it, right? Or maybe you're dealing with some stuff around yourself, around self-harm or other things, right? And so, a lot of these stories create a lot of harm for people and make it really hard for us to connect, right? Again, back to the small groups piece, right? Human beings want to connect. We are inherently built to connect with other people, right? That's why the internet is so powerful, right? But if you can't connect with people who are like you, that's a huge problem for us. And it leads to a lot of sadness, a lot of self-hatred, a lot of questioning, what's wrong with me? Why am I like this? Right? Yeah. Who else?
This person talked about being very open with sex throughout their entire life, but not finding other people who they thought they could talk to about sex or sexuality, which led to a lot of isolation and fear that the type of sex they were interested in wasn't something that other partners would be interested in doing, like swinging, polyamory, and kink.
That's part of the things about queering sex ed that I think is really important. Sexual liberation and autonomy is powerful, right? Sex is a powerful way to connect with other people, right? And if you're building networks through your sexual power, what do you get called?
Slut.
You call it a slut, you call it whore, you call it whatever else, right? That's why I have professional slut. Right? Because it's powerful to do this stuff, right? And like you said, oftentimes we're isolated in this, right? We think we're the only ones who think about it. We think we're the only ones who want this, right? Part of what has changed my life has been the vulnerability to voice what I like and what I want. Not just in sex, but in a lot of realms, but especially around sex and sexuality. Right? Because a lot of times for me, I was afraid to voice what I wanted because I didn't think anybody else would want me once they knew that. But it turns out if you're the one who's willing to be vulnerable first and put yourself out there, you'll find a lot of other people that are interested in what you're interested in. Right? But it takes that scary vulnerability of sort of stepping off of that cliff a little bit, right? And really seeing if you can fly or not. And for some people, you may be in a position where you can't, right? If you're poor and you're working a service job and you risk being outed and losing your job, like you might not have a lot of freedom to do that. Right? If you're living with your parents, you might not have a lot of freedom to have fivesomes. Right? Okay, we could talk about this again, like I said, all day, but let's move on. Who gets left out of sex ed? Right? When we think about, and I want to expand the realm of sex ed, right? So not just what you got in school, but what do we see in romantic movies? What do we see in books? What do we see in porn? What do we see in even just the relationships out in the world, right? Visibility of relationships. Who gets left out?
An audience member said, everyone who is not white and cis, meaning cisgender, or someone whose gender is the same as the sex they were assigned at birth.
Everybody's not white and cis. That's the really short way of saying exactly what's going to come up on the side over here. You know? Yeah, exactly. So the short thing is white, able-bodied cis people, right, are the ones that we see having sex, right, and usually thin folks. Sometimes you'll see a fat man, but never with a fat woman, right, unless it's like the whole point of the TV show is that they're both fat, right, and then they just make a ton of fat jokes. But, right, who else isn't represented? What don't we see?
This person said, people who are not beautiful.
Yeah, exactly, right? People who aren't conventionally attractive or beautiful, right? We have this really tiered system of beauty that, again, is based on whiteness, on colonialism, on sort of these legacies of what it means to be beautiful means to be valuable, right? And what it means to be valuable, it means to be valued by capitalism. And so people who we see as that also get harmed, right? People who we see as beautiful get told, well, it's your fault that this happened to you if something bad happens around sex and sexuality, right? You were asking for it by just being attractive, right? So like there's that piece of it. And then there's the other piece of it of like, well, nobody would want to have sex with you anyway, right? Oftentimes when we talk about oppression, what we're talking about is false choices. We're talking about people lose either way, right? If you're a trans woman and you present yourself as hyper feminine and really cis-passing and you really dive into that side of yourself because it's just authentic for you, you get told that you're upholding feminine stereotypes and that you're destroying feminism because you care about all these things that women shouldn't have to care about and whatever, right? But also, if you're a trans woman who doesn't do any of that, who doesn't really care if you have some facial hair, doesn't care if your voice is a little bit deeper, or who just can't afford to do things that aren't like that, right? Then you also get told you're not trying hard enough, this isn't serious for you, you don't really care about this, so I'm not going to respect you, I'm not going to respect your name, I'm not going to respect your pronouns, whatever else. Right? So when we're talking about oppression, we're talking about people lose either way. Right? If you kneel, you're not doing it right. If you fight back, you're not doing it right. You put your fist up, you're not doing it right. Right? You set a trash can on fire, that's way worse than somebody getting shot. Not actually. Right? But we oftentimes just look at one dimension of that, right? And we don't look at the ways that people lose either way in the constructions that we make, right? So yeah, who else gets left out of sex ed?
This person said, neurodivergent people.
Yeah, exactly, right. So sometimes you do see neurodivergent folks, but oftentimes it's in this narrative of curing or making better, right? You don't really see someone who's like got borderline and just like is in a relationship and it helps manage their borderline, but it's not like fixing everything, right? You don't often see folks who are autistic falling in love with other folks who are autistic. You don't see a lot of that type of stuff, right? And same thing with physical disabilities as well. We don't see people in wheelchairs unless they're a prop of the story, right? Or unless they're, but we don't, oftentimes just like we don't see trans folks where they just happen to be trans, but the story's about something else, right? We don't often see disabled folks where the story isn't about their disability or their status as a disabled person. What else?
This person in the audience shared that we usually only see main characters engaged in sex and relationships, and we don't often see side characters or villains getting complex relationships as well.
Yeah, I actually hadn't thought about that. That's a really good point, right? We only think heroes deserve sex, right? We only think protagonists deserve sex, right? We don't often see people who are just like having sex. This is what they do, right? Oftentimes it's in service of the story, in some way it's in service of something else, right?
Another person in the audience shared that we usually see sex as a reward of a successful journey or something that happens after the happily ever after.
Exactly. Or it becomes your reward, right? Okay. So folks of color, right, get left out of this. Unless, oftentimes you see something like Moonlight, right, and that's really powerful and that's really important. But also, it can't just be a movie, then it becomes a people of color movie. Right? It becomes something that white people see to like feel better about themselves about seeing something about people of color. Right? But oftentimes folks of color are expected to see themselves reflected in whiteness all the time. Right? You're expected to be able to just watch TV shows and identify with people on the Big Bang Theory or whatever. And it's like, right? But we don't expect white people to do that same work. We don't expect white people to see themselves in stories of people of color, right? Disabled folks, we already talked about that. Fat people, we talked about that as well. poor people, right? So oftentimes we don't see poor people just like being happy and having good sex, right? Sometimes you see poor folks having sex or being sexually assaulted as like a story piece, right? Or as a way to show like, oh, look at this poor depraved person, they can't really, or you see, we're going to talk about sex workers here in a second, right? But sort of that negative around sex as like it's this bad thing you need to be redeemed from, right? Which again, colonialism. We don't see people talking about consent a lot, right? We usually just jump right to the sex, right? And sometimes if you're in a relationship and you've maybe talked about this a lot, or you know your partner's body a lot, or whatever, like you might not explicitly talk about consent very much, but we don't even see like, ow, you're on my hair, right?
That's true.
We don't even see like, my clit isn't there. Right? Right? Although my clit's pretty easy to find. Easier than most. It's inside. Right? But we don't see people talking about consent. That's one of the things, so when we talk about porn, right, one of the things that I really enjoy about, if you've watched, like Courtney Trouble is a queer porn filmmaker, or even like some of the kink.com videos or stuff, they include the consent conversation as part of it. Right? They include them talking about using gloves or using lube or stopping to put a condom on, or like that type of stuff is really powerful.
Yes.
When you think about how can porn reclaim the narrative around sex and sexuality. Right?
Yes.
Okay. Sex workers, right? Oftentimes if we see sex workers, or I see sex healers a lot, we see people in really, again, usually poor, usually people of color, right? These like really situations where we're supposed to feel sorry for them, but we're not supposed to identify with them.
Another person in the audience added that we look at sex workers in media and say, oh, I feel so sorry for you. I'm sorry that you've been reduced to sex.
Right, exactly, right? And so, yeah, so we have a lot of shame around that socially and societally, and we don't see it as inherently valuable or something somebody would choose to do because they enjoy it, not only be forced into it through classism and oppression. Right? Although that certainly does happen as well. There's a privilege of being able to choose to do sex work if you do. Right? If you have that choice. Non-monogamous people, right? We talked about this up in the front a little bit, right? Or what do we see, right? We see like love triangles and cheating and lying and hiding everything, and right? So even if we do see non-monogamy, it's often in this sort of lascivious context around stuff, right? There are some things that are changing this narrative. Does anyone watch Unicorn Land on video? Check that shit out. That's so good. Unicorn Land. It's pretty good. It's still got some stuff, but it's definitely better than most things that I've seen. And deals with the experience of being a third, of like being invited into other people's relationships or dynamics, right? But we don't see those stories, right? So people say things like movies are so boring now, and I'm like, well, it's because we've been telling the same story for the last 100 years. Right? We need to get into spaces where people of color, where poor people, where folks with disabilities, or whoever else is telling their stories, and that's where the richness really is. That's where the unexplored territory around these conversations are. Right? So non-monogamous folks, we don't usually see that. Kinky people, we don't usually see that, again, unless it's a plot point. Right? Unless it's like, either like, look at how messed up this person is, or it's like a CSI thing, right? Where it's like, we're going to see this dominatrix, and she's like, wearing her leather at home, and I'm like, shit, I'm not doing that. Nobody's wearing their leather at home unless you're gonna do it, right? Okay, so kinky folks, we don't really see that, right? Queer folks, right, are often left out of these conversations, unless, again, right, just like with media with folks of color, right? Queer media is its own category, right? That becomes its own separate thing, right? And so, again, we're not asking straight and cisgender and people who are part of that dominant narrative. We're not asking them to identify with queer people as a universal story. We're providing it as like a secondary substance. Like, here's the buffet table, and then there's like some scraps on a plate on the floor, and you can eat it if you want. And then trans folks, right? So oftentimes if we see trans folks, again, it's a tragic story, right? We don't often see trans folks just enjoying themselves, having fun, getting in relationships, falling in love, doing things that trans folks do. Who here's seen Her Story on YouTube? Jen Richards and Laura Zach. Okay, that's another one to watch. Her Story. Okay. There's also a video game that came out with the same name, so it's hard to find, kind of. But if you search for Her Story and then YouTube, yeah, you'll find it. And yeah, and that was by Jen Richards, who's a trans woman, and Laura Zach, who's a cisgender queer woman. It's got Angelica Ross in it, but it's not focused on their transness. It's not somebody coming out and transitioning and going on hormones, and it's basically after all that stuff. It's like if you imagine what would have happened, and then you skip to the third movie in the series. It's like it just jumps in right there. Right? So yeah, check it out. Her story it's really good. But oftentimes these exceptions prove the rule, right? When you see one thing, like I'd watch fucking San Junipero like 25 times. Yeah. If you haven't watched that either, it's a Black Mirror episode. It's really good, but it does queer femme relationships really, really well. It's just sad when you realize how small that representation is and how hard it is to find. And then intersectionally marginalized people. Right, so oftentimes if we see somebody who is one of these identities, it's their only identity.
Right.
Right, we only see them as a queer person. We only see them as a person of color. We only see them as a person with disability or a fat person. Right, we don't often see the overlap of those things, or if we do, it's really minimalized. Right, when you see Queen Latifah, like she's showing up as a black woman, but she's not showing up as a fat woman very much. Right, it's like we really not to her fault, of course, but like the way that the media is constructed. Right, of like we don't often give people all of their identities at once. Right? So I already kind of talked about this, but I believe personally, and I hope you all agree, that we must expand what we consider sexual health, right? Beyond barrier methods and use lube because that's the reason condoms break because you not enough lube, and all that stuff is important. But if we don't see sexual health as including ethical communication and including power and privilege and pleasure and queer inclusive language, that's not what sexual health is, right? We have to give people the tools to talk about sex and sexuality in an open way. And that includes language. That includes safe spaces where you can have those conversations. That includes ways to talk about power and privilege and to talk about if you're somebody who's got intersectionally marginalized identities and you're dating a cis white man, there's going to be power there. There's going to be things you need to talk about there. Right? And if we don't give people the language to talk about how power and sex often are invisible in our society, then we set people up for failure again. Same thing with pleasure, right? It might be really scary to be an adult in a middle school talking to people about pleasure. But like if you don't tell people that sometimes you just have sex because it fucking feels good, then you're setting people up for failure. Yeah. And same thing with queer inclusive language, right? When I go to get an STI screening at a like trans inclusive clinic, right? Which means they just like added it to their website, but they didn't really do anything, right? When I go there and they ask me, do you have sex with men, women, or both? I don't know what the fuck to say. When they're asking that question, what they really mean is do you have sex with penises, vulvas, or both, right? Because they want to get to what fluids can you be exposed to? What type of sex are you having, right? But they don't say what they mean. They don't ask those questions. We just use gender as a proxy, and really just sex assignment at birth, as a proxy for everything else. Right? And so how do we queer that language? How do we say what we mean? How do we build spaces where we can be vulnerable enough to say something, and then if someone pushes back on us, be like, oh, I'm just using more inclusive language that is going to better able to serve the whole community. Mm-hmm. Right? That's not very hard to say, but we don't want to say it because oftentimes we use future fears to justify current hurt. Right? And so we say like, I don't want pushback from transphobic people, and I don't want parents to get mad at me, and I don't want whatever. Those are all future theoretical fears, right? But we're causing real harm right now. And that real harm can end if we do some really, really simple things that we choose not to do. Sexual health that focuses on STIs, barrier methods, other technical skills. It doesn't mean very much if you don't feel empowered to talk about sex, right? And then also sexual safety and risk assessment needs to include emotional risk, physical risk, and medical risk, right? So oftentimes we really just think about medical risk, right? We think about risk of getting an STI, again, sexually transmitted infection, risk of having a child if you're having the type of sex that can lead to pregnancy, right? That type of thing. We don't talk very much about emotional risk, right? We don't talk very much about I'm having sex with somebody who's not good for me, that hurts me, that makes me feel bad, right? We don't give kids the tools to talk about that stuff, and then when we don't give kids the tools to talk about it, it means adults don't have the tools to talk about it either, and then they also can't talk to their own kids about it. When it comes to this stuff, there's an empathetic way to talk about that that's meaningful, right? And that's age appropriate. I'm not saying like go show kids porn or whatever, right? Like they'll find that when it's right for them, but what I am saying is that we should be able to say things like, if somebody makes you feel bad, don't be their friend.
Yeah.
Right? Like things that are really, really simple that would have made my life a lot easier to know that I can walk away from somebody that hurts me.
This person mentioned that we should not require our children to hug family members and friends that they don't want to hug.
Exactly, right? We do a lot of non-consensual things around kids' bodies, right? And tell them they have to hug people, they have to touch people. And then again, back to things like neurodiversity or whatever, right? If you have physical stuff, we have things, right? Like we don't give people the tools to advocate for themselves and say, hey, I love you, even though I don't want to hug you. Right? We just make that translation of loving equals hugging for everybody. Okay, so this is a case study in queering sex ed. When I was in college, I worked at CU Boulder, that's where I also went to school, and I was an HIV tester. So folks would come in, they would get a rapid finger stick test, which the way that works is you poke somebody's finger, you take a little bit of blood out in a pipette, and then you put it in a test, and that test has to run for 10 minutes. And so during that 10 minutes, we would have a conversation about sex or barrier methods or whatever else. And so initially, my boss at the time was a queer woman and was really informed around intersectionality. And the process that we were using when she originally came was not informed around that stuff. And so originally the things that we did, just kidding, here's my thesis. It's not really a thesis because I don't want to go back to school, but it's my thesis in my brain. Education that centers the needs of marginalized people creates better education for all people.
Yeah, great.
Okay? People who have privilege are also hurt by their own systems of privilege.
Right.
That doesn't mean we should lose track of who's really targeted in those systems. And it doesn't mean we should lose track of who bears the brunt and the outcomes of that systems. But education that centers the needs of marginalized people will make all education better for all people. Right? That's the first part of my thesis. The second is that education should give people tools, context, language, and information to interpret the world in a meaningful way, right? Not memorize it, right? So a lot of our education is around memorize these things, spit back to me what I say to you, right? A lot of those type of things, right? And when we're doing that work, we're not giving people the tools to actually analyze their world and actually like create their own synthesis of information. We're just basically like putting people in a fascist environment and saying like, here's how you survive. So education should give people tools and really start at a more base level, right?
Yes.
If you're memorizing all the names of every country, but you don't know who drew those country lines, right? Like that's fucked, right? And then finally, education needs to meet people where they're at, not where you think they should be or where the average is, right? So you see this in college a lot, right? Where like white professors will say things like, well, you know, these folks of color, they come in here and they just didn't have as good of high school and they're just not really ready to do it, but I'm just going to teach the way I teach, and if they get lost, then that's their fault. That's not okay, right? And it comes from this idea that we don't meet people where they're at, and we're not real about the reasons that those circumstances exist in the first place, right? The fact that school is tied to property value, and property value is tied to whiteness, and white people were allowed to buy houses in the 50s when black people weren't, right? So like, we have a legacy of why that is the way that it is, and instead of working on making that legacy better, we just project it back on folks and say, you know, well, you really should try harder, right? So education needs to meet people where they're at, right? Especially around sex and sexuality. You need to meet people where they're at. You can't have conversations that they're not ready for yet, but you also can't talk to 16-year-olds like they're fucking 8 years old and then expect them to listen to you. I say fuck a lot, I hope you don't. Okay, so from assumptions to clarity is what I'm calling this part, right? So our original HIV testing was full of a lot of assumptions. And those assumptions were informed by whiteness, by upperclassness, by being in a college environment, by able-bodiedness and cisgender folks and straightness and all these other things, right? So originally our process required a legal name from an ID. So when you came in to check in, you had to give somebody an ID, and that name was the name that they would call when you came in to get your test, right? Which, for the vast majority of people, was not really that big of a problem, right? But for the people who it was a problem for, it was a problem, right? And so oftentimes we think about like, well, it's not really that big of a deal, right? But oftentimes, if you say things like, we're not seeing trans people here, what you actually mean is either trans people don't feel safe enough to come out here, right? Or we push them all away successfully, right? So if you build inclusive spaces marginalized people will come as long as that trust level is real and it's an authentic space that you've built, not something you've built just for your own PR, your own marketing shit, right? All that kind of stuff. But if you have spaces that are built by and for marginalized people, those spaces will have more inclusive stuff, right? But we private legal name. Other thing that we did, our intake asked about gender by listing man, woman, and other, right? Which is a problem in a lot of ways for trans folks, right? The first is that, well, I'm a woman, right? So circle that. But then they assume that that means I have a vulva, right? And they assume that I have certain types of genitals, right? And so then I'm forced to mark other, which is, again, like its own form of violence, right? And we're creating normal and other as categories that you're justifying the violence that then happens to people in those other categories, right? And you're creating a power differential just through your language. Every intake form that we do, every training that you do, anything that you do in your organization is a potential space for an intervention. It's a potential space for you to do an educational intervention around what's happening, right? This does not do that. No explanation of the process to clients. So people would come up, they'd wait in a really nervous waiting room with a lot of other people, sort of like, and then they would get called their legal name on their ID, and then they would go into the room and we would have a clipboard, which is another thing that's going to come up here in a minute, and we would have a very opaque process where we did not tell people what we were writing on the clipboard, we didn't tell the people how the test worked, we didn't tell the people why we were waiting 10 minutes, none of that, okay? And some of that, I think, was the assumption that people had maybe done it before. But in addition, like, we don't want to make those assumptions. Do you have sex with men, women, or both? Right? I already talked about this, right? I have sex with a lot of women that have penises. Okay? Like, that doesn't mean anything to me. It doesn't do any good for me, right? And again, non-binary folks, right, are not really a part of that. Private information collected without transparency, right? So how many folks have been, like, to the doctor's office or a therapist or psychiatrist and they're sitting there scribbling notes on their thing? Like, as somebody with anxiety, that freaks me the fuck out, right? That makes me so nervous. Terrified. I don't want to be doing that, right? So private information kept from people, very opaque, right? Again, this is a power differential here, right? Who has the power to have clarity in what they're doing? Who has the power? Who lacks the power in that? Who's forced to just go along and live, right? STI and barrier conversation was the same with every client. So every time they come in, we had a script. It was about 10 minutes that we had practiced. And it was, here's barrier methods you can use, here's how HIV is transmitted, here's ways you can have safe sex. And it was very one way, right? It was us talking, them listening, right? And it may not have been information that was even helpful to them, right? But it didn't really matter because we were the ones with the power and we were the ones telling them what to do, right? How many folks have been to like a clinic and that's been your experience? A lot of folks, yeah. And then information was presented in a lecture style, right? So no feedback, no conversation, no, is this relevant for you? Somebody may have been asexual and sexually assaulted, so it was the only time they've ever had sex in their entire life, right? This information would not be helpful for them in that case, right? Or you can at least ask them, do you want to know this information? Okay, so what did we do? Our new process, pseudo-anonymous. Give us a name to use for you, right? There's a note. Oh, there was a note there that I just got rid of it. There's a note here that we did. So the way a rapid HIV test works is it's not, if it's a positive, quote unquote, it's called reactive because there's a chance that it's a false positive. So it's not like a sure positive. So then we would send them to a state facility where they would get a blood draw and get like a full-on test that would confirm whether they were HIV positive or not. So we didn't even have to know their name. And that was something we didn't realize until we started breaking down this process. And we're like, why the fuck do we need to know somebody's legal name? There's literally no point in this process where we ever need to know that. Yeah. Right? And if they need to get counted within state statistics or get connected to insurance information about HIV or whatever, they can do that through the state. We don't have to be the ones doing that. Intake asks about gender with options for man, woman, trans woman, and a write-in box for not listed instead of other. Right? I love not listed. I think that's important. I don't like forms that say other on them, or just have a write-in box completely, right? We were doing this because we were collecting data, so it was easier to input those things. Figure out what works for you around that stuff. But giving those gender options, and again, your paperwork should be an intervention, right? If somebody comes up to you and they ask, what's a trans man, right? Well, then that gives you a time to have that conversation. Or if they're in the room after the intake and they're like, what the heck was that, right? Why does it ask about your pronouns? Right? Then you can use that as an educational moment to tell somebody, Well, hey, some people might not use the pronouns that you assume, right? So think about ways that you can use your process as an intervention. Ask for pronouns on intake, again, avoids conversation in the room or guessing, right? A lot of times people will be like, how do I ask somebody about their pronouns? Oh, that's so scary, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, build it into your process as much as you can, right? Have it on your intake, have it on the web form that people fill out, have it on your name tags when you're doing something, right? And again, this isn't as like a forceful outing piece, right? Trans folks should know that they can put whatever pronoun they feel the safest in that space using, right? It's not that you have to force people to out themselves with their pronouns. But you want to avoid guessing, and you want to avoid the awkward conversation in the room if you can, right? If you can't, the thing that I tell folks to do, and what I'll do, is I say, hey, I'm Sarah. I use she, her, and hers pronouns. What's your name? What pronouns do you use? Right? To put yourself out there first. Make yourself vulnerable first. Because oftentimes what we're doing is we're saying, like, you look queer enough to need other pronouns, right? When we ask somebody what their pronouns are, right? So give your own first, is something that I like to say. Paperwork is an intervention and can serve as education. Your questions, the questions that we ask, assess potential risk by asking about exposure to the 4 fluids that can transmit HIV, which are blood, semen, vaginal secretions, and milk. It's very rare that STIs can be transmitted by milk. HIV is, I think, the only one, or one of the only ones. And oftentimes when you look at places where HIV is really, really prevalent, and a lot of it isn't being passed through sex, it's being passed from mother to child through breastfeeding, because folks either can't get clean water to use formula, or they can't afford formula, or they're not given it, or they just choose not to use it, which is their choice as well. Right? But oftentimes that's the way that HIV is spread to young folks. So here we're saying what we mean, right? Because I don't give a shit if you have sex with men, women, or both. Well, honestly, in that conversation. I mean, that's great. I'm glad you're doing what you want. But that doesn't mean anything. What actually means something is, what do you have the potential to be exposed to, and how can you reduce that risk, right? If you're having the type of sex where you're never being penetrated by a penis, well, then we don't need to talk as much about how to put on a condom correctly and making sure you use enough lube and whatever else, because that's not the type of sex you want to be having, and that's fine, right? Or we can talk about it, and then in the future, if you decide that's the kind of sex you want to have, then you can be informed about it, but we're not making assumptions based just on answers of what people want to be doing, right? Avoids identity of partners completely, right? And also assumptions around how many people are you sleeping with, right? Because I know people that fuck 50 people, and I know people that fuck 2 people, or 1 person, and sometimes the people fucking 1 person are doing it in a much less safely, right? And so we can't make assumptions about how many people you're having sex with and how safe that sex is. And then the last thing is, we want to empower people to assess their own risk in the future, right? So it's not about you memorizing all these things that I'm going to tell you, right? Because a lot of times that's about power. That's because I want you to come back to me. I want you to feel like your only avenue to this information is through me, right? Not me, but whatever, right? But when we empower people to assess their own risk, when we tell people, here's the ways HIV can be transmitted, here's the ways you can prevent that risk, then it doesn't matter if they start having sex with penises later on, because then they know that information already, and they don't have to come back and ask about it, or be afraid to ask about it and have risky sex without knowing it, right? And again, people aren't risky, but the sex they have might have risk associated with it, right? And then the last thing was, we were trained to notice domestic violence, relationship abuse, sexual assault, and really see holistic sex health, right? So not just what are you doing with your bits and how are you protecting them, but like, are you emotionally protected? Are you in a safe enough relationship where you can ask for these things to happen? Okay, so how do we build radically inclusive sex ed?
Talk about it, says one person in the audience.
Talk about it, exactly. Exactly. I should have had that come up here. Say what you mean. Don't say men when you mean penises. Think about, what are you actually trying to ask about, what are you actually trying to do, and then get into that, right? But don't make assumptions about when you say, getting married, that means to somebody who's of the opposite gender, right? Or whatever we use, right? Say what you mean. I already said that. But I kind of shouted it. Educate yourself about power and privilege so you can have informed conversations about power and sex. right? So if you're a person who has privilege, if you're a masculine identified person or a man, right, cisgender man, if you're a white person, if you're a person who has class privilege, if you're a person who has able-bodied privilege, right, learn about that privilege yourself. Don't wait for your partners to tell you about it. Don't wait for your partners to tell you when you did something that crossed boundaries or was assumptions based on your privilege, right? Learn about your own privilege. There's a really great quote in an article that I can't remember the name of right now. Welcome to the racial justice movement. Here's what you missed. And it's from Iwajima Olo, I think is her name. And she says that privilege is a gun that will always autofocus on people of color unless white people learn how to re-aim it. Right? So your privilege will always hurt people, intentionally or unintentionally. Okay? So educate yourself about your power and privilege. Where do you have it? And how can you use it? Sex positivity, right?
Yes.
Sex is an inherent good for human beings, right? And again, I mean more than just like putting bits inside of bits, right? But I mean cuddling, intimacy, love, caring for each other, beating each other up consensually, right? Whatever you choose to do, it's a net good in your life. Even if you've had bad situations, right? Shitty sex happens, sexual assault happens. I don't want to hide those things, but we need to see sex as a fundamental good and not something shameful and scary that we need to hide from. Right?
This person asked if we are putting so much emphasis on sex positivity and that sex is a positive thing for people, does that mean that asexuals are somehow wrong or not sex positive?
Sorry, I misspoke. I guess I mean intimacy here when I say that. So building connections with human beings, finding meaningful relationships for you, finding networks that work for you, finding any sort of physical intimacy if that feels good for you. All of those things are net positives in your life, right? So yeah, asexual folks build just as strong connections with other people, just as meaningful relationships. Yeah, totally. Thank you for that. Right, so buffet style, right? We're all coming up to dinner, pick what you want to eat, right? And then find the other people who want to eat that too. Yeah. Pleasure is an integral part of sex ed, even for youth, right? So when we talk to young folks, we need to be honest that sometimes people fuck because it feels good, right? Sometimes people do kinky shit because it feels good, or it feels bad that feels good, right? Okay, accurate, appropriate information about risk and how to prevent that risk, right? So not shame-based, not fear-based, not showing a ton of nasty fucking pictures of STIs that have gone untreated for years and years, right? Not that yeah, right. So we're not doing fear-based stuff here, right? But we do want to be accurate about the risk, right? We do want to let people know that these things can be dangerous and that here's how you can prevent that danger, right? Or here's how you can minimize that risk, right? We can never completely get rid of risk, but we can minimize it. No fear-mongering, no scare tactics. And then accurate sex ed, like I said, delays for sexual encounter and it improves your sex life, right? So young folks who know what they're getting into when they're thinking about sex, right? Oftentimes our barrier of losing our virginity is really fucking high, right? Like getting fucked by something is like a really intense thing to do with somebody. And if that's our barrier that we're like expecting people to get to show that they're like cool or down with it or that they're whatever, right? We trample over everything under that we see as under that, as like leading up to that, right? It's like we don't see cuddling as its own like inherent good activity. We see it as like a preamble to having the real sex, right? Well, for me, sometimes cuddling is the real sex, right? And so how do we destigmatize that, and also how do we give folks the tools to explore sexuality in a way that makes sense for them, not where they feel like it's a race to always get to the end first, right? Because then people get trampled in that. And then paperwork and process is an intervention. Your paperwork is an intervention, okay? What you put on your paperwork says a lot about your organization. It says a lot about who you are. It says a lot about your values, right? And use that intentionally. I would so much rather have a white cisgender man be uncomfortable that I'm asking him about his pronouns than call somebody the wrong pronouns because I didn't ask, right? He's going to be able to shake it off. And in fact, it might expand his world a little bit once he gets over his bullshit, right? But he gets to go on into the day and just like not really think about it again, right? But for folks who need that, for folks who use they, them, theirs pronouns and they finally get asked about it and they like finally get to use it in a like medical room with a doctor, that shit is awesome. It matters, right? It changes lives for people. So do that. Center marginalized people in the conversations that you're having. Center the people who are at the margins of what we see as normal in our mainstream society. And then use that centering to then teach other people and make your education better as a whole. Okay, that's what I got. Thank you. Has anyone here listened to the podcast? It's okay if you haven't. Queer Sex Ed, you can listen to it online at queersexed.org, or you can find it on whatever podcast app you have. And that's all our social media stuff. Does anyone have questions for me or things that they want to ask about? Can we hand out the evaluation? Oh, you already did?
Yeah.
Oh my god! Yay! Fucking rad. Cool. Anyone have any questions?
This person asked, when you travel to college campuses and talk to students about sex and sexuality, what things do you cover and what do you talk about?
Yeah, I cover intersectionality, right? So I ask white people to learn about the legacy of racism and colonialism in this country. I talk about the ways that power and privilege influence the conversations that we're having. And I try to put myself in a situation where I'm not too rigidly boxed into presenting out to other people, but where I sort of let the room collaboratively build that, especially at a Pride Center or something where I don't know the local community, I don't know what people are interested in. That's why I started today with having you all in small groups, because that helps me get a read on how folks are thinking about this or what's in the room. So yeah, I think that's important. And then also, when I'm talking to college-age folks, you have to be aware that they have all of this baggage that's been built in by other things, right? By their middle school, by their high school, by whatever else, and everyone's in a different place. And so being able to both meet people where they're at and also push their boundaries a little bit. Not push their boundaries, I don't like that. Push their edges a little bit on stuff, right? Expand their sort of knowledge around things, but not in a way that makes them feel bad for not knowing it in the first place. Yeah. It's okay to not know. It's okay to ask questions. I want to normalize all of that stuff. Yeah. What else?
This person was wondering if we could reframe risk around sex as similar to how we look at driving, where we are aware of the risk and we do what we can to protect ourselves, but we don't use shame and stigmatization to stop people from driving just because we know that there is risk associated with it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to think about it. I think a lot about driving, especially related to like risk in general, right? When people say when they talk about like this is too risky, we can't do this policy because it's too risky, whatever. I'm like, well, we all take risks every single day, right? Every time you get in a car, it's like probably the riskiest thing you do, right? And so how do we? But we see that as a part of what we just have to do, right? And so how do we talk about those conversations in a way that allows people to reduce their risk? If you don't want to drive, don't, right? But that doesn't stigmatize or shame either way.
Yeah.
What else? Other thoughts, feedback, questions? Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
First of all, awesome. And do you have any like resources, or do you yourself? I have to go watch the podcast. Have any information on how to make like hospital visits or clinic visits more queer? Like that's a huge issue, and I don't know. Like, it's a thing.
It is, yeah. So I in my personal life do trainings around that stuff. So I think that's sort of my own personal way around doing that. There's some good guides on like birth language that's gender neutral, or like some other things out there. But yeah, that's a big sphere of our lives that's really focused on sex assignment at birth. That's really focused on assumptions around bodies, around fatness, or around disability, or around being person of color, or whatever else. That I think, yeah, we need more information around that stuff on. I would say S. Bear Bergman is a really awesome trans person, and he writes a lot about just transness in general. I don't know if he's written specifically about medical stuff, but I'd see if he has anything about that. And then also Toby Hillmeyer is another good writer about that stuff. And if they're not writing about it, their work can connect you to people who are probably. Yeah. Any other things? We got like maybe one more minute, one more last point. Did you want to say something?
An audience member asked if it was better to have just a write-in box on your intake form for gender and sexuality, or whether it's better to have a few options to show people that you are aware of trans and queer identities and will be accepting of them if people put them down.
Yeah, I kind of like that, having both, like having some options that are the sort of biggest buckets that exist out there. Trans man, trans woman, gender queer, gender fluid, however deep down that list you want to go, and then have not listed, so that folks can say that. And then if you, in your not listed, you keep having stuff that comes up a lot, then maybe that's something you add to your piece.
Yeah.
If you didn't have a gender on there and you're seeing 4 or 5 people that put a gender, then like, oh, maybe I should add that. Right? So yeah, that's kind of forms as intervention.
Yeah.
So I think listing a few things sort of keys folks in so that you're thinking about that, right? Same with sexuality stuff, right? Put lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, queer, whatever else. And then also on those things, I think it's important to say you can circle more than one, right? So one might like identify as like queer and also a lesbian, or like other pieces of that, right? So yeah. And that's what I mean by sort of centering the most marginalized folks, right? Where it's like we put ourselves in situations where we assume what we think about people. I'm gonna hand out all these cards because I just got them and I'm really proud of them. If you have extras, feel free to give them to me on your way out, or you can hand them to folks too. But yeah, so what I mean when I say we center the most marginalized people, right, is putting ourselves in positions where the people with power, the people with privilege, they can understand discomfort, right? So if you're an ally, your job is to take up the discomfort of marginalized people, right? That might be the discomfort of learning about, like I said, this history of racism and what this country's done to indigenous folks, right? That's uncomfortable to learn about, and it is your work to do that uncomfortable work, right? Using they, them pronouns might be uncomfortable for you if you're using them with somebody that if you've never used them with other people before, right? But one way that you can use your privilege in that situation, because you don't have to navigate discomfort very much if you're a person who has privilege, right? And so if somebody is a marginalized person, right, if you're a person of color who's in white spaces all the time, you always have to navigate that discomfort.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep, exactly.
Right? If you're a trans person who's in cisgender spaces all the time, you always have to navigate that discomfort. You don't get a choice. Right? And so part of the privilege is choosing to engage in that discomfort and putting yourself in situations where you are not the dominant group, or you're not the group that's in power and in charge, right? And where the assumptions made are not about you, right? Are not like with your needs in mind, right? And so people who are privileged can deal with the discomfort of like, why does it say pronouns here? That's kind of weird, whatever, right? And it might expand their mind, right? It might make people think like, I've never thought about having to use pronouns before. I've never thought about saying my pronouns before, right? So use your forms as intervention. That's all I got. Thank you.
You're listening to Queer Sex Ed, a sex-positive podcast that centers queer and trans people in discussions of sexual health, relationship communication, sex work, non-monogamy, pleasure, and BDSM. This project is not intended to be a medical, professional, or comprehensive resource for sexual health. Additionally, if you need more information about sexual health and you are under 18, please visit Scarletine at www.scarletine.com. Queer Sex Ed is an imperative statement. When we call to queer sex ed, it is a call for all sexual health educators, schools, parents, and people in all types of relationships to intentionally queer the institutions of sexual communication, sexual health, interpersonal relationships, and relationship structure. We believe that we must turn sex ed on its head. Even when sex ed is at its best, it is often intentionally or unintentionally exclusionary of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, genderqueer, gender fluid, agender, polyamorous, and asexual people, in addition to many more social groups who engage in just as many relationships as straight, cisgender, and monogamous people, but who are forced to do so through uncharted waters, lack of media representation, and massive social stigma. The goal of this project is to share the stories of myself and others in sexual health, sex positivity, and everyday queer sexual life to normalize authentic conversations about sex, pleasure, boundaries, health, and communication. You can contact our show at queersexed@gmail.com with any statements to help us grow our perspective, better support all people, and uplift marginalized voices. Please reach out and share your thoughts on the show.